Hello and welcome back to Study History with Mr. P. In this video I'm going to be looking at crime and changing definitions of crime in the early modern period, so from 1500 to 1700. And there are a number of factors which influence what made something a crime in this period. So one of the first factors was religious change and how that affected changing definitions of crime. So the change in religious situation across England between 1500 and 1700 led to many religious beliefs and activities being newly classed as crimes. So Protestantism grew because more people came to believe the Catholic Church needed reform. And on the back of this, heresy and treason were the two most serious crimes connected with religious change. Now, heresy was seen as a crime against the Church and an offence to God. Heretics were seen as a danger to others, and the punishment for heresy was being burned at the stake. However, many took the opportunity to recant rather than be burned at the stake. Treason was a challenge to the authority of the ruler, and this also became connected with heresy as well, because monarchs from Henry VIII onwards, apart from Mary I, were the head of the Church of England, and therefore anyone who challenged the ruler's authority as head of the Church would be guilty of treason too. Now, how did the monarch then have an impact on these changing definitions of crime? Well, changes to the law showed how much power monarchs had in deciding what counted as a criminal activity. And the issue with this period is there's such a vast amount of religious change that the religion kind of flip-flops about between Catholicism and Protestantism, and this changes in turn what makes something a crime. So let's start with Henry VIII, who ruled from 1509 to 1547. During his reign, not the start, but during sort of the middle part of his reign onwards, Protestants were executed for heresy, and then later in Henry's reign, Catholics were executed for treason when they refused to take the oath of supremacy. Next came his son, Edward VI, who ruled from 1547 to 1553. He made Protestant changes to the Church and therefore imprisoned some Catholic bishops, so going further in the Protestant Reformation than his father Henry had. Next, though, came Mary I from 1553 to 1558. She made the Church in England Catholic again, and therefore about 300 heretics were executed for refusing to follow the Catholic faith. And then next came Elizabeth I, who ruled from 1558 to 1603. Now, she at first tried to find a middle way in religion and introduced an act of supremacy as well as an act of uniformity. But this led to the prosecution and execution of hundreds of Catholics. And then comes James I from 1603 to 1625, who introduced strict anti-Catholic laws, forced Catholics to swear loyalty to the king and pay fines for not attending the church. And this continued indeed under the reign of Charles I too. Now, another factor that affected what became crimes was changes in society and the way society viewed certain things. So vagabondage was one of those. So vagabondage, so being a beggar, the growing population and falling wages, as coupled with rising food prices, meant many people left their villages to search for jobs. These unemployed, homeless people were known as vagabonds, but they were also seen as potential criminals. New laws were therefore introduced to deal with this threat. So, for example, in 1547, the Vagrancies Act meant that able-bodied vagrants were branded and sold as a slave. The 1597 Relief of the Poor Act introduced harsh punishments to deter vagrants, and the 1601 Poor Laws Act divided people into deserving and undeserving poor, and this impacted on whether their begging was a crime or not. So vagabondage was seen as a threat to society, and this is part of the reason why it became a crime. And it also became a crime because, unlike medieval times when people were more tied to their land and couldn't leave their village, those laws have been relaxed, allowing people to move, but therefore creating the crime, in effect, of vagabondage. Next up, we have rural crimes. So large areas of land had become enclosed from medieval times onwards, which meant fenced off. This made it difficult for people from the villages to survive because they had previously used the land for firewood, for wild foods, wild animals, and so on. The 1671 Game Act made hunting on enclosed land illegal, but it was also seen as a social crime, something that is against the law but which many people didn't care whether or not it was upheld. So many people turned a blind eye to this and certainly wouldn't turn in their neighbours for committing a crime. Smuggling is something that becomes a crime during this era as well. In the 17th century, the government introduced import duties on a range of goods. People made a profit by smuggling these goods into the country and selling them at a much lower price than goods which had been taxed. So this crime was created as a result of import duties. And finally, for a short period of time, there was Puritan rule in England from 1653 to 1658. England was led by Oliver Cromwell, who was a radical Protestant or Puritan, and laws were introduced to ban things like sports on Sundays, drinking alcohol, and festivals or feasting on days like Christmas Day. Also, recusancy, so fines for refusing to attend church, were decriminalised in this period.